So this is a bit of an autobiographical piece that looks at my almost 55 years of contact with the RCAF or the Air Element or the Air Force small a, small f, because it's morphed over time, and that's a good thing. But it has left me at certain moments uncertain of whether I loved it or was it perhaps only just ambivalent about what the Air Force had to offer me. I'll start with a bit of an anecdote. So it's roughly this time of year in 1970, and my father says to me, "Son, if you want to go to university, have you considered this ROTP thing, because it pays all expenses?" And I thought, okay, I guess I'll give it a try. I went to the recruiting center. They said, yeah, your marks look good, blah, blah, blah. What would you like to do when you get into the military? And I said, darned if I know. I was really looking for a free education. And that came, but it came with strings. So got home, told my father, he said, up at the end of the street, there's an Air Force navigator. Go talk to him and see what he might suggest. Well, I don't recall this gentleman's name, but I do recall his advice. He said, when you go back into the recruiting center next week, you tell them you want to be a pilot. You do not let them discourage you from that. So I did, and they said, okay. I didn't realize that probably about half of the intake that year would have said the same thing in various recruiting centers, and there would be a winnowing process as the years went on. So this is actually the fourth time lucky that I'm giving this talk. The first time was almost 2 years ago. A naval aviator, and they sometimes call themselves nasal radiators, in Halifax asked me if I would like to speak as the keynote speaker at the opening of the Western Canada Aviation Museum, and I would do it on Zoom. And I said, I know almost nothing about aviation in Manitoba 100 years ago. He said, that's okay. What would you like to talk about? And I thought, and I said, the best thing I could offer would be my journey through learning about the Air Force over half a century. Perfect, he said. Well, he liked it enough that earlier this year, he invited me to the USI of Nova Scotia to do the same pitch. And so I thought, okay, it must not have been all that bad. So off I went, and I spoke to a group of about 15 people, mostly serving or retired military, including one Lieutenant General Larry Ashley, who had commanded the Air Force and was himself a nasal radiator. And he said, this is pretty good, I like this. A couple of weeks ago, I went to the Maritime Air Veterans Association in Ottawa and spoke to them, tailoring it a bit to naval aviation. And many of the officers with whom I've worked, or for whom I've worked, who were naval aviators. And again, I was not thrown out of the room, so I thought, okay, I don't have to change up my talk for today, it should work. But I am going to try and tailor it a little bit for the current audience. So, what I want to talk about is my experience over these last 50 years of discovering, largely for myself, how the Air Force has thought, worked, fought over the last 100 years. And I certainly would have preferred if I had had some of that wisdom, some of that experience taught to me, offered to me by the Air Force, but that hasn't always been the case. And so that's kind of my theme. Not really sure where I'm going. Seem to be going in good directions, but not always certain. And perhaps not always sure that, in fact, I'm not going on what's called a reciprocal heading, essentially 180 degrees from where I'm supposed to be going. So the next 20, 25 minutes is me, to use another navigation term, I'm going to track crawl. I kind of know where I'm going, but the wind and other things, maybe something that looks interesting, are going to divert me off the straight line, but I hope to get to the end with you still on board. So I finished RMC, and off I went to flying training. I learned about flying, and I learned how to fly, but I didn't learn a whole lot about the Air Force over the span of a couple of summers and about a year of constant flying training. Intriguingly, when I started at Portage-la Prairie at 3 CFFTS, Canadian Forces Flying Training School, flying the Musketeer, The first 2 weeks that we were there, we went through something called the Air Operations Branch Orientation. Couldn't even call ourselves the Air Force in 1973. It was the Air Operations Branch. Well, that was a series of lectures, some on personal security, some on marching, this sort of thing. But we also did 2 cultural trips from Portage la Prairie into Winnipeg. We did 2 brewery tours. I didn't realize at the time that that was actually part of the Air Force culture. Maybe something I should have known about, certainly something I experienced later, and later I came to understand why perhaps booze was the drug of choice of many aircrew. Anyway, I survived all that. Only tried to kill myself or my instructor 3 or 4 times, and then ended up at 408 Squadron as a young officer. I quickly was appointed the squadron historical officer, and I had essentially an empty ramp, a blank canvas. The CO came to me and said, I've looked at the 35 millimeter slide presentation that we have. It's atrocious. I need something better, and I need it as quickly as possible. And I thought, okay, is that all I do as squadron historical officer? Oh, there's this annual historical report. And I looked at the last couple of years' worth, and I thought, there's really not a lot here. Like, there's 3 pages. It meets the minimum standard directed by National Defense Headquarters, but it doesn't, I couldn't pick that up and tell you what the squadron did, who was in it, et cetera, et cetera. So, having an interest in aviation at this point, by virtue of building plastic model kits as a kid, I started to flesh out the report. I put in all the officers on squadron and who had come and who had left, and all the aircraft that we had, because some are transferred in and some are transferred out, and the major activities that we had taken part of. So the first year out, that seemed to be okay, but then something got in the way to divert me and everybody else as I was starting to think about the second annual report. And this was the Russian satellite Cosmos 954 coming to rest in the Arctic in late January, early February of 1978. Well, good thing for us, we were just coming off a winter exercise in Shiloh, Manitoba. We knew how to camp. Air Force people camp, they don't go to the field. We knew how to do that at minus 40. It was cold, but we could survive that. The rest of the Air Force was maybe not quite so worldly wise. They were used to operating from main operating bases. Perfectly normal if that's your job. So it was very much a learning experience for the whole Air Force. That's me, by the way, the guy on the right-hand side of the top right slide, and that's the airplane that we flew to a place about an hour's flying time from the nearest community where some Inuit hunters had found these massive ice cubes, probably about the size of one of these insets and from floor to ceiling, that hadn't been there a few days before. So it turned out it was a natural phenomenon where the lake had frozen to such an extent that it popped up these blocks of ice. But we didn't know that. We thought it could be radioactive stuff. And it was on the track of the re-entry debris. Well, as I say, the Air Force didn't know all that much about how to do this because there was no history of this period. Not that anyone could find. There was only one book written immediately after. It was called Up Morning Light by a fellow by the name of Leo Heaps. And I remember being in the bar in Yellowknife as he interviewed some of my mates, and that's how he did his research to write this book. It wasn't the book here, the book that came out 40 years after the event almost, which did look in a serious way at Canada's northern experience. Had we known about that, that's a 408 Squadron Lancaster doing mapping and charting, perhaps we would have had a better sense of how to navigate in the north. We would have had a better sense of how to operate on snow and ice at minus 40. But we didn't. Our squadron was in good shape, but some of the others, it wasn't the most wonderful experience. Back in my squadron historian's job, again, here's another 408 aircraft, the Hampton flying suitcase. I'm not sure if that's a 408 Halifax. I didn't know anything at all about the experience of the RCAF and 408 Squadron in the war. I had to get that from British sources. There were no good published Canadian histories in 1978 that I could find, and certainly it's the days before the internet, what to do. Moreover, didn't really know anything about the human condition. We had crashes from time to time across the Air Force, one person at a time, typically maybe a couple. But what was it like to operate in wartime? What was it like to deal with flyers who were experiencing a 250% casualty rate in Bomber Command in 1943, where the chances of getting through a tour were about 20%? Well, a friend of mine, Alan English, a transport navigator, in the late 90s as part of his PhD, wrote about that. He wrote about the selection process that took place here in Toronto, what has become DCIEM, how psychologists from U of T generally were the world experts on selecting people appropriately based on their capabilities, both physical and intellectual, to fly an aircraft of any type. We didn't have that information, didn't have anything close to it. We didn't have an official history. I was writing a history of 408 Squadron with a complete void in terms of what Canada's experience of war was, as far as the Air Force was concerned. The first volume of the official history, which doesn't talk about an Air Force because we didn't have one, something I didn't know, that virtually no one in the Air Force knew, Canada's airmen in the First World War, didn't come out until 1980. Creation of a national Air Force that looked at things that Ted Barris has researched and written about, the BCATP and the home war establishment, didn't come out until 1986. And the volume that I could have used to look at 408's experience, 408 being formed as a bomber squadron during the Second World War, that didn't appear until 1994. For about 15 years, the Air Force community, historians particularly, have been talking about a fourth volume. It was part of the original concept of tracking the history of the Air Force up to unification in the mid-60s. That volume is, I don't know, is it close to taking flight? Is it close to engine start to get out to the runway? We're not really sure. There are teams that are formed and disbanded from time to time within National Defense Headquarters and now the Air Force History and Heritage Office in Trenton. But Volume 4 ain't there to be seen, and what a pity during the Air Force's centennial year that has been the case. I'll come back to that in several minutes. Also part of the Air Force history, 408's history, was this thing called the CJATC, the Canadian Joint Air Training Center in Rivers, Manitoba, an old Air Force station not far from Portage, not far from Shiloh. I had flown by it several times. Didn't know that 408 actually operated Hercules aircraft in parachuting trials and operations. Didn't know that 408 Squadron operated the T-33 as a fighter in air-to-ground operations. All of these were central to the sorts of things that I needed to know about in my job as a tactical helicopter pilot. All of these things were topics that would have been in Volume 4 if it existed, or if it were to come to fruition anytime now. So I left 408 Squadron for the second time, post-command, in 1993. I'd already survived 3 years in National Defense Headquarters as a ground tour, 1 year in helicopter procurement, come back to that in a minute, or maybe non-procurement, at the very end of the Cold War, and 2 years in this fascinating job, which I think maybe has contributed to some of my lingering health problems. Certainly my gallbladder didn't enjoy it. In language training, policy plans and operations. So it's a big mouthful, interesting job, but we can talk about that at the break perhaps. After I finished flying, I was going to go and do my master's in war studies at the Royal Military College and then teach, of all things, psychology. But due to being the one domino in a domino effect, I ended up going instead to 215 Yonge Boulevard to teach at the Canadian Forces College. I'd been there as a student, I enjoyed my year there, never wanted to come back to Toronto, which is typical of most people in the military. They say, Toronto's interesting, but it's too big and scary for me, thank you very much. I was there for 10 years and came back for 3 years as a full-time reservist, so I learned to love the city and the Air Force sort of at the same time. I should have a better slide, actually, of the CF-104 that's roughly in the same location as that Lynx armored reconnaissance vehicle. I showed up at RMC at the end of 2009. What I wanted to do there was teach air power. There was one course at the undergraduate level, there was one course at the graduate level, and so I got going, teaching those courses, I had a number of officer cadets, some of whom, as in this case, went to the Laurier Military History Symposium and presented their papers there on topics of air power. I met two good friends, both the gentleman here in uniform, one of whom has just come and stolen my seat, so I'll deal with him later. Paul Johnston, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Paul Johnston, still in uniform, and beside him in the middle is a man who's been working in history and heritage in the Air Force for about 30 years now, Bill March. And so this brings me to two things. One, while I was there, that master's that I hadn't been able to take at RMC, I was now able to take at RMC through a distance program. Thank goodness RMC had the intellectual flexibility to allow people to do their master's programs part-time at a distance, and that almost before the internet existed. So I got through that, and as I was moving along, I said, I'd like to do a thesis. I've never written anything more than a few thousand words, and those are usually disasters, but maybe I could try something bigger. What could I do? And so I approached the Directorate of History and Heritage in Ottawa, and I said, if I was to do a master's, what do you think might be of any use to the Air Force or to you? And the answer was, you worked in procurement, didn't you? And I said, you're right, why? I knew the reason. I said, how about a master's thesis that looks at Air Force procurement in Canada? And I thought, this is going to be an awfully painful experience because that's what my 12 months in working in procurement had been in NDHQ. But I said, okay, let's do it. So, oops, I've gotten ahead of myself here a bit. I beg your pardon. I'm going to hit the P slide. Yep, no, I'm going to hit it again. I've obviously been too close to the track bar there, but I have to stay close to the microphone. So I started off looking at procurement. I discovered, because the Air Force hadn't told me this, that we had at Canadian Vickers designed, manufactured, and then had the Air Force operate bespoke seaplanes. I learned that at Victory Aircraft, up the road here, not too far, at Malton, we had built bombers, fighters, trainers for the RAF and the RCAF. 16,000 aircraft had been built in Canada during the Second World War. I also learned, not coincidentally, that no aircraft engines had been built in Canada during that period. These were starting to tell me things that I might have been found useful when I was working in that procurement job. Who had made those sorts of decisions? And so when I got into doing my thesis, I said, I'm going to start at the operational end of requirements because that's what I know. But I quickly discovered that that's at the bottom end of a scale of other decisions made at the national level, political national level, sometimes at the alliance level, as to who can build, should build, and does build what aircraft. And so the very successful Sabre and the less successful CF-100, both built in Canada, one under license, one designed and built at Avro, what had been Victory aircraft. These were amazing lessons for me. And I thought, this is the sort of stuff that people working in procurement should know about. People working in defense policy should know about, but there's no history that covers this period. At about the same time as that book came out, another book came out that looked at the very long gestation period of the Sea King replacement. Almost as long as the gestation of the the F-35 decision. So here are people working in procurement, multi-billion-dollar programs, and they're going in and operating more or less by the seat of their pants if they haven't had a chance to look at the historical example and say, oh, okay, I can't tell the people at Western Development to shoo-shoo. I have to actually listen to them. I have to do things. That's what you get for going to your grandson's hockey games and being too spirited. The other thing that came to me later, as I looked at issues of procurement and I looked at the Cold War buildup, was yes, we had put an air division in Europe flying F-86s. Yes, we had contributed to 3 lines of radar, including the McGill fence, designed by scientists at McGill to defend Canada against the Russians coming over the pole. But what we hadn't really thought about very much, and again, it's my good friend Dr. Al English that has done some research, is how did we entice people to go to Europe? how did we entice people to live at these little radar sites? Well, we had to take care of families. And so the picture in the bottom left is the newly retired Chief of the Air Staff, Wilf Curtis, and some Air Force officers in Europe standing outside a permanent married quarter apartment block. I think it's at Zweibrücken in Germany. There's a radar station at Falconbridge. The thing that everybody always thinks about is the radar domes and tracking stuff. But behind is the domestic site. That's where permanent married quarters are built. That's where there's a school, there's a bowling alley, there's a bunch of stuff so that families can go with the service person to those places. Now, when I say service person, I'm not saying serviceman for a very good reason. Right back to 1941, we've had the women's division of the RCAF. How did we bring those people, those women, into the service? How did we use them, more so use than disuse or misuse them in various jobs in the Air Force that men could have done, but there simply weren't enough men? What's that telling us about things like diversity that we've just had this major flare up in, thanks to some neighbors to the south, in Halifax last week, where the whole question of women in combat should be a non sequitur. It should be something that we don't even think about in this country anymore. But it's not just because of the last 10 or 15 years in Afghanistan, it's because of the experience of the Air Force going back decades. How do we think about the representation of various ethnic groups and racial groups? The RCAF has been open to people of any background for decades. So here are lessons that we could learn. Here are things that we could explain to Canadians and to ourselves that we're largely ignorant of. So I guess my sub-theme is Al English is a guy that's had a lot of thinking and doing, and maybe it's because guys who sit in the back seat have time to do that while the pilots are fighting the controls. Al's actually a great guy. He wrote this about 2006, a book about military culture, and while it talks about all the services and it talks about the US and Canadian militaries, when I read this I said, well, I said something else, but I'll keep it clean for the camera. This is something I needed to know decades ago. I needed to know this before I was a CO. I needed to know this before I was a flight commander. I needed to know this very early in my career to understand that there's a culture that we operate within. Just like there's a culture at IBM, just like there's a culture at U of T, and in any big organization. But I have no clue what the Air Force's culture is. This started me down the path of wanting to know more about that culture. So at this point, what am I doing for time here? Almost done. Okay, I started to think about education in the Air Force and how does it work or how does it not work. On the left here is the front of the building of the Royal Canadian Air Force Aerospace Warfare Centre in Trenton. The concept for that centre is about 20 years old. The centre was actually built just under a decade ago, and it's supposed to be an airfoil. Well, the sad truth, in my view, today is that airfoil is stalling. There's a lot of problems, I think, with how the centre operates, and it's because it's ill-resourced. It is teaching a course for the first time in a long time, an air and space warfare what's it called? They keep changing the name, but anyway, they bring in about 25 or 30 about to be promoted to major young officers every year, and they teach them about air operations, but they don't teach them about Air Force history, about Air Force culture, unfortunately. That's been a constant problem. Back at RMC, the only military education establishment in the 1930s, the first two Air Force officers, slide is backwards here, sorry. First two Air Force officers to join the staff were one, Squadron Leader Clifford McEwen, later known as Black Mike McEwen, the commander of 6th Bomber Group. And he was there for only a year, and the second officer there also for only a year, Squadron Leader George Waite, came in to try and add some Air Force content to the RMC program. And they had lots of good ideas. You can see down the right-hand side the sorts of things that RMC wanted to bring in thanks to their influence, but none of those passed because the war was coming. And so in 1938, the year after these proposals were made, you can see there's only one line of Air Force activity in the RMC curriculum. And so learning how to fire, I think that's a 17-pounder, learning how to fire a field gun was part of the RMC curriculum. So even if you're going into the Air Force, you know how to operate a field gun. Okay, but not really anything at all about Air Force culture, operations, any of that. The Air Force learned during the war, as did the Navy, that they needed some sort of a program for their own young officers. And so by 1947, Royal Roads on the West Coast is half Navy and half Air Force, and the two groups learn about the other service. The Air Force officers spend a weekend on a submarine. The Navy officers go to Comox and see what's going on there. At about this time, the minister, Brooke Claxton, says, I need to think about reopening RMC. I need to think about what to do with Royal Roads, and I think I need a college in Quebec to entice young francophones to join, because it's a cultural mix. So he goes to two Air Force officers, Wilf Curtis, a man who has great connections to Toronto, who will become chief of the air staff in that same year, and Curtis and his henchman, Ernie Stedman, who is a preeminent Air Force engineer, the one who has pushed the idea that we need a combat aircraft designed and built in Canada. They do two studies on education, and it ends up with RMC coming back into business, and by 1959, it having a degree. A degree because we need officers who can think. The Staff College, now run by George Waite, from 1943 to 1945, has a syllabus, I would say, that's second to none. And it's not about teaching just Air Force stuff. It's about, and this is from the 1959 syllabus, teach the student to think straight and get their ideas down clearly on paper. How many of you out in whatever your jobs, your careers have been, you get something handed to you and you say, I'm really not sure what this is all about. I'll send it back to the author and say, help, I don't understand. This is what the Staff College was dealing with in terms of officers who were very good at flying or fixing or doing other things in the Air Force, but they were now going on to middle and senior management, and they needed to know how to think and get things done. And not what next job, any next job. So it was a very holistic education. That program went away with unification. A colleague of mine has said the Air Force program was so successful that the Canadian forces glommed onto it in 1965, and the Air Force Staff College went away. The Army Staff College has never closed, but it teaches tactical stuff. So about 10 years ago, Chief of the Air Staff, Lieutenant General Mike Hood, who some of you may have met, said that he wanted to start creating a pool of Air Force professionals, people who did understand the Air Force and could inform decisions. At that time, he sponsored a conference at RMC where we brought in people from various air forces to look at how they had, what their education philosophies were and what some of their programs were. We have a wonderful presentation from a gentleman from the Royal Australian Air Force Air Power Development Centre that has a staff of 100. Thinking about things Air Force. Our shop down in Trenton could have a staff of 100, but I think it's less than 50 at this point. The cubicles are empty. Anyway, fascinating work. The other thing that Hood wanted to do was create an air power stream within the War Studies program at RMC. And he directed his staff to start selecting officers and posting them to the college. And I and a couple of other people developed courseware that would allow students to focus on the Air Force. Not exclusively, but enough that they would walk away saying, I know how our forces work, think, etc., etc. We got 2 applications in the first 2 years, and then the whole thing died. The staff, 1 level or 2 levels below Hood, had essentially stonewalled us because it wasn't important, because they didn't know what they didn't know. So that brings me to a conference in Calgary 2 weeks ago, where the deputy commander of the RCAF said, got many new fleets, a whole bunch of platforms, but we also need sufficient numbers of aviators, so people to sit, bums in seats in airplanes. Yes, that's true, bums in seats in tool cribs to do the repair work. But we need air power professionals. And so that's where we are today. We need people, just like we did 10 years ago, just like the Air Force recognized in the 1950s, we need people who understand air power, who can explain it to the rest of the institution and to the rest of Canada. And we're just unfortunately not there yet. So, what I learned when I was flying in Moose Jaw, if you're uncertain of position, you have to check navigation. Do a couple circles around that grain elevator, most of which are now gone, so I don't know how the students learn to navigate out there. So think about where you've been, understand where you've been, and that's going to help you to get where you're going. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about is this work that you'll see a couple of copies of over on the table here. When I kept thinking about and suggesting to people that the volume 4 for 2024 was needed, and the answer kept being, we're working on it, we're working on it. A couple of friends, one of them being Bill March, and I sat at the Queen's Grad Club drinking cheap beer one day and said, let's put a bunch of people together who have done some research on the Air Force in these 2 decades, and let's see if we can't produce something. So it came out about a year ago. University of Toronto was ecstatic. It's an academic bestseller. It sold over 500 copies. And we're really happy that it's come out. We've had some pretty good responses to it because it does capture what happened in the Air Force from the end of the Cold War until unification. And we're now starting to work on a follow-up that will take Air Force experience through to the end of the Cold War. So that's me. I have one more slide that I sometimes show. This. Oops. Some of you may have seen this cartoon in the Aviation Digest, which comes from the U.S. Army Aviation Branch. Harry Reisner was a journalist for years, flew in the back of a helicopter several times in Vietnam, and this and the cartoon are his understanding of how helicopter pilots think. So this is me. So if I come at these last few minutes in a somewhat at least ambivalent, perhaps even negative fashion about where the Air Force is and where it's going, it's only because of my flying experience. I'm confident that there is the willpower within the Air Force and within the Canadian aviation community to go forward and successfully. But by George, for me, it's been a tough half century, one that I wouldn't give up, but one that, as I say, has not necessarily been the most joyful half century of my life. I guess it's the only half century, so I'll have to live with it. Anyway, that's it. I've run over time. Thank you very much.
Now we have a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Randy? There's a microphone right there. Yes. Go ahead, Randy.
Randy, one of the things that we both learned at the conference at U of C a couple of weeks ago was when we sat with Billy. What was his last name?
Flinton.
Flinton.
Yep.
How he's got the pilots that you talked about there who are looking to the future, the professionals, got one hand in the cockpit or one aspect of their lives in the cockpit and the other one looking forward to the technology. That's really an aspect of flying and the future of protection in the skies over Canada that needs a lot more work too, I think.
Yeah, I would say it does. Sorry. The book that sort of got me started in books was the PhD dissertation that I did, where my supervisor, Terry Kopp at Laurier, some of you may know the name or have met Terry, he said, I would like somebody who's in the Air Force, maybe even a pilot, he said, to look at this stuff I've got on Bomber Command operational research. And so I think that's kind of the comparison to what you're saying. I knew enough when I looked at the files to be able to make something of them in terms of distilling conclusions. I was certainly not in Bomber Command. I've never flown in combat like Billy Flynn has, but I could at least attempt those connections. And I think if you look at any profession, you would like the people who are doing medical research to have maybe practiced. You would like people who are coming up with new laws to have perhaps been lawyers or have worked in public policy. So that connection between having flown something and thinking about the technologies that we need, I think is good. If Al English was here, he would say, I don't think it actually has to be someone who's flown. It has to be somebody who understands, can put their minds around the problem and think about the solutions, be they technological or otherwise. Al's a big proponent of not necessarily needing somebody with wings on their chest to be the CO of a unit. And he goes back to the Great War, actually, and he says, the guy, it was always a guy who kind of ran the squadron, wasn't the CO who was out flying. It was the adjutant, it was the old guy, 35, maybe even 40 years old, God forbid, who knew that they needed spare parts, who knew that they needed, you know, the ration tent to be put up again because it blew over the night before, who understood the business and could therefore provide for the necessaries to do the business. I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of talked all around it, I think.
Any other questions? Mike?
What sort of, don't know if this is on, what sort of support are you getting from the chain of command in the Air Force and Defense Headquarters in the importance of understanding the history and understanding the relevance?
So I would invoke Chatham House rules a little bit, although I have no connection to the Department of National Defense nor the RCAF, and say it's somewhere between problematic, accidental, and not really on their radar. There are indeed big problems to solve. History's not one of them, but how many great thinkers have said, if you don't understand your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Now, we're not going to repeat the technological problems because the technologies are different, but we're going to see the same sorts of technological challenges. How did we bring aircraft in 1914? How do we know what the spares ratio was? How do we know what effective training was? And on we go. The one thing that hasn't changed, I argue, in 100 years of flying, military flying, is the human condition. What do I do with the guy or gal who can't go up again? But, you know, do we declare them lack of moral fiber and send them to the kitchens? Or do we find a better way to rehabilitate them or just habilitate them? So it's unfortunate. I proposed at the conference last week, I said, you need to create a cadre of air power professionals who can work at RMC to teach the young folks, who can work at the Staff College, fill in all the empty desks at the Staff College, of which there are some. There's now, for the first time ever, there's an Air Force visiting defense fellow at University of Manitoba. So this is a good thing. We need more of those. At Calgary, where they had the conference. People at Queen's have typically, there are 2 visiting defense fellows at Queen's, they're typically Army officers. Why not Air Force? Why not Navy? I think it's too big an investment by Canadians and by people in uniform and everyone in between not to do the best we can do in understanding at a conceptual level what the challenges are and how to resolve them.
I was working, but it didn't sound. So what I was going to say was, I'm still serving. I've gotten out of the regular force, and I'm now a
Press the
reservist.
bottom button and I
But
got
I'm
a
working
flash.
as a reservist at the Air Force History Office, and my day job is to work on an official history for the Air Force to cover the post-war period. But my secondary duty was to be the editor of the RCAF Journal, which would be one of the mechanisms that would do all of this. The RCAF Journal, if you go to their website right now, is currently in a operational pause because the Air Force said, so we've got to absorb the F-35, which will take people and billions of dollars, and probably people is the bigger problem there. And we are short of people, as you hear in the news. It's true. In fact, it's worse than what you hear in the news, frankly. We can talk about that later, maybe. But it's, you know, we're short of people. And so what do? When you're in a situation like that, what do? You prioritize things and you rack and stack, as we say, and say, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to stop doing that. If you don't, if you just give this talk, right, which is what leaders are prone to do, and you don't stop, then really you have no concentration of effort. So there has been an effort in the Air Force to identify what to stop. So guess what was identified to stop? All the stuff that Randy has been talking about for the last hour. We have paused the journal. I pleaded for it because I said, look, I'm retired. I'm a semi-retired guy. I do it as a secondary duty, and the cost to this is actually, frankly, zero. And you know what the leadership said to me? They said, PG, I know that, but we've been told to identify things to stop. And every time we try and identify something, there's a constituency for that, and they say we can't, you can't stop that. And so guess what are the two things that I know that have been actually stopped completely? Guess what they are? One is the journal, and the other is doctrine. because who needs to think about what they're doing doctrine-wise, right?
And we're not flying the CF-18 as a demonstration aircraft.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure what the story is there.